The Last of Us came out at an interesting time. 2013 was the last year of the PlayStation 3 generation. The PlayStation 4 was right around the corner and was released in November of 2013, and the system wasn't backwards compatible. So while The Last of Us was receiving endless praise and was arguably a system seller for the PS3, Sony was trying to get players to transition to their new hardware. So it makes sense that Naughty Dog would create a remastered version of the game to sell on the PS4. A superior version that showed off the power of this new hardware. Of course, this also brought along a superior version of The Last of Us Factions, 60 frames per second with all DLC maps included in every playlist, and some new features planned and bug fixes, of course. This ushered this multiplayer mode into a bit of a renaissance as the community continued to grow, as Factions was regularly being sold as a pack-in for the PS4, growing and growing the player base, and as support for the game under Naughty Dog continued. But how long would the fun last? Dr. Pooplove here, and this is the history of The Last of Us Factions, a multi-part podcast series discussing the history of this beloved multiplayer experience. In prior episodes, we talked about the development of this game, the early days on the PS3, and the major evolutions and changes that occurred. And today, we'll talk about the rise and the fall of the remastered Factions on the PS4. So, without further ado, let's get into it. July 29th, 2014 is when The Last of Us Remastered was released on the PlayStation 4. Naughty Dog had, as I mentioned in the last episode, made some pretty significant updates to Factions up to this point. 8 maps were added, as well as payable guns and perks and customizable items. And about 1 week prior to release, they pushed a live update that made a few changes to Factions on the PS3, which we would see incorporated into the PS4. There was a couple of balancing tweaks, such as agility level 3 being removed and agilities level 1 and 2 being rebalanced, as well as some other additional tweaks to the new perks that had been added. So these were already baked into the PS4 version, but there also would be a number of additional new things brought to that version that would actually come to the PS3 about a month later. For one, the hunting rifle scope was altered to show the headshot hit marker. So in the past, it had shown what looked like a body shot marker, but the horizontal and vertical lines of the scope blocked out those markers, so you couldn't really tell if it was a body shot or a headshot until you got that notification that you got a headshot and the additional parts. They also tweaked the hunting rifle scope at level 2 to look a little bit different, and also the hunting rifle now got a significant boost in damage. It was now doing 70 damage instead of 55. It would still be 2 body shots to down, but players were able to finish off wounded enemies more easily. And this introduced something that a lot of players hated, and that is the combo. Now what this was is using a hunting rifle, getting a body shot, and then switching really quickly to a revolver and downing them really quickly. And this was viewed as pretty cheap in many ways because a lot of people prided themselves on using the hunting rifle and getting headshots rather than body shots. But this made it almost just as viable, and it kind of encouraged players not to try to go for headshots because you had this much easier method to secure it down. That's why you might see a lot of players like me using the hunting rifle without a revolver, using it with a 9mm, so that in the event that I do get a body shot and I do want to finish them off with a 9mm, I can somehow feel a little bit better about myself. Additionally, there was a little bit of a reduction in aim assist on the second level zoom of the hunting rifle and the military, as well as a fix for being able to buy ammo for purchasable weapons on the waiting to respawn screen without the price going up. People were beginning to exploit this. You could basically buy purchasable while you were respawning for a much cheaper price than live in the game. There was also, some other bug fixes and an improved team balance, and all of this was ready and packaged together when The Last of Us Remastered finally did release. Now, one of the most significant upgrades that the remaster did was it made the game 60 frames per second, which was really a game changer for a lot of people. It just felt so much smoother. People felt like they were more accurate. It was very visually striking and appealing, and it's actually funny because this was at the beginning of the PS4 era that they had made this game 60 frames per second, and a lot of people, especially me, it kind of put an expectation in our heads that all PS4 games would come out at 60 frames. We'd come to find out later that even Naughty Dog's next game, Uncharted, would the single player would come out at 30 frames per second, and a lot of games came out at 30 frames per second. So it's kind of funny that this is one of the pretty much few games that managed to get 60 frames on the PS4. The other good update that occurred with this release is it consolidated all the DLC into one playlist. So everyone who bought the remastered essentially received the DLC map packs for free. It's funny because this part doesn't really get mentioned in the more recent conversations about The Last of Us Part 1 remake and how that was $70. A lot of people say, yeah, sure, it includes the Left Behind DLC, but it doesn't include the multiplayer. And so maybe that makes it a little bit of equivalent. But the remaster did include the Left Behind DLC. It also did include the multiplayer, but not only that, it also included the DLC map packs, which were going for about maybe even $15 a pop. So by getting the remastered version, you were getting some tremendous savings. On the other hand, though, this was about the time that PlayStation had begun requiring PlayStation Plus in order to play online. So on the PS3 version of the game, you didn't really need PlayStation Plus. You could just play online, no problem. But with the PS4, people had to get PlayStation Plus. And I can't remember, but those that were on the PS3, that may have been a requirement for them around this time as well. And so this game came out, and people that had the PS4 version of Factions were very happy. Those of us on PS3, however, kind of felt a little bit screwed because, by the way, I was on the PS3 version for almost a year, maybe 9 months before I actually got the PS4 and the PS4 version of this game. And if you were on the PS3, you basically saw the player base dwindling by the second as this PS4 version came out, because it wasn't crossplay and it was also the inferior version. So anyone that had secured a PS4 was often going for the remastered version to get that upgrade. And yeah, I was on the PS3 for quite a long time. The player base started dwindling. We were still able to find matches, but it was a little bit harder, especially the DLC 1 playlist, which had Bookstore, Bus Depot, Hometown, and Suburbs, was a little bit harder to find a match. And I mean, with all those different player pools, it was just not as good. And of course, like over time, as people peeled off, it just became laggier, and you ran into cheaters a little bit more often, and it wasn't as fun. But for those on the PlayStation 4 version, they were having a blast. And actually, the community was really starting to grow. So, of course, the community grew pretty well during the PS3 days. I remember, for one, I would always go on the Last of Us Faction subreddit, and there was always some really interesting topics, people getting into debates, people sharing skills and secrets, and it was awesome. And then, of course, you have your content creators from the PS3 era. Sancho West, of course, had the best tips and tricks tutorials, and I don't think I would know how to stealth in this game if it weren't for him, especially learning how to shiv. I got most of my skills directly from his videos. And then McKillers was another pretty notable one who analyzed people's gameplay. He kind of gave you a little bit more in-depth analysis of strategy and what players were doing. And then he also was very good at coming up with unique games and modes and challenges that people could play. There was I remember Protect the President, where 3 people teamed up would try to defend a completely random player for fun, as well as other like private fun matches. Like these types of things were happening on the PS3, but I do feel like on the PS4, the community really began to shine. Of course, there was content creators, Nick A30 is especially one that a lot of people have a lot of fond memories of, and he, had a lot of fun videos, tips, and also challenge videos as well. But I think one of the game changers here was that the PlayStation 4 allowed everyone to basically have a channel and post content, because the system had the ability to record and capture your gameplay. It also had the ability to go live on Twitch, and this really allowed everyone to kind of participate. For one, Sancho West was able to do his top 10 plays, and this was really sourcing captured footage from people that were able to play on the PS4 and capture their best moments. For me, especially, I took a lot of time to watch the more try-hard players and really try to understand like how they played and what secrets they knew and kind of how they reacted to certain situations. I did that quite a bit in order to try to hone and perfect my own abilities with the game. And then, of course, during this time, this is when we got to see a lot more community events. I'll talk a little bit more about some of those, but first I want to get to the next major patch which would release and how this would affect the game. So this was actually a live update to patch 1.02 on the PlayStation 4 version, and this added new weapons. This added the variable rifle, the scoped semi-auto, the scoped full auto, and the scoped burst rifle. Now, I do remember at this time, many people were more afraid of the scoped weapons than anything else, less so the variable rifle. But it actually turns out that the scoped weapons weren't really that great. I mean, to be fair, the scoped burst rifle can be fairly powerful, and the scoped semi isn't that bad either. But for the most part, these haven't really been used as super viable options, and the scoped full auto is more or less a joke of a gun. The variable rifle, however, was very strong. And of course, these were paid DLC weapons. Variable rifle, of course, it allowed you to scope in and out. The only other weapon that could do this was the El Diablo, or the hunting rifle at the second level / military sniper, which just allowed you to zoom from the scope in and out. But the variable rifle was really good. It was fast. It was pretty accurate. I mean, it had a lot of good qualities to it. It's a very strong weapon, and I would consider it a top tier weapon. I think at this point, the burst rifle still beats it out, but the variable is still a pretty strong alternative, especially on a little bit more longer range maps where the burst may not have the advantage. This live update also included some updated preset loadouts that incorporated some of these new weapons. But alongside this, a few days after these weapons came in, was the introduction of the last 2 maps, free maps in this case, that would be incorporated into all playlists. And this was Beach and Financial Plaza. That's really funny because these 2 were added and they're free, of course, but I remember at the time when this came out, because they were more fresh, Naughty Dog made it so that the playlist showed these maps a whole lot more often. And so it got to a point where, yeah, it made sense within like the first week or 2 to be seeing these maps showing up regularly. But after that point, those who were playing this game, I remember there was a time it was just like Beach or Financial Plaza like every other game, and I was getting so sick of these. They did eventually fix that, but I remember it got a little bit insane. Now with this, we had all the maps added and a good number of new guns, but there was also some community events going on that are notable. So the first one that I want to talk about is the Reddit records. So this was something going on in the Reddit community, and this is one of those things that really was only possible with the ability to capture and record footage. Although you could record from your phone on PS3, but it kind of was grainy and bad, and you had to record and delete a lot. So what this was basically though was for each gun you could try to get a record, and that was how many downs can you get with a single gun in one match. I will say that I got the bow Reddit record, and I was very proud of this. And if anyone that did get one of these records was given a golden weapon as their flare on the Reddit, and it was a really nice badge of honor. And it was a really fun event. You submitted your Reddit record entry and you got the thing, and people were kind of able to, get their name out there a little bit. And it was a fun challenge way to experience this game, a little bit of a meta game that, wasn't a part of the main game. Now, the other community I want to talk about that was rising at this time as well is the competitive community. And most specifically was the Fragged Nation community. So Fragged Nation, a lot of people may have heard this word, but maybe don't know the origins of it. They might know, FN rules or FN mode or whatever. Fragged Nation was a website. It was a ladder website that allowed players of games to compete and establish a ranking for their team. Now, Fragged Nation had been going on since the PS3 days, essentially right after the Apocalypse tournament concluded. Fragged Nation was a thing. I think even before that as well, Fragged Nation was going on. People were enjoying the competitive scene, but I think it really exploded during the PS4 era. Especially, I think, because people could capture their gameplay and perhaps brag a little bit. It became a way for try-hard players to basically gain a little bit of clout and reputation within the community for their skills and ability to beat other players. So, Fragged Nation, the rules were a little bit more simple at the time. It was no armor, no Molotov, no purchasable weapons. That was basically it. And there was, at the time, a PS3 ladder and a PS4 ladder. I, of course, was playing pretty actively on the PS3 ladder at the time, but the PS4 ladder was very active. And it was so much fun to watch these competitive matches. You know, without armor involved in the equation, I feel like it becomes a little bit more tactical when you're playing. You really have to be kind of careful. You really have to be good with aiming. It really kind of honed your skills, and it was very exciting to watch and play, of course. Now, there are, of course, some notable players in the competitive community. There's this player, Japo, who was a sniper, and he was kind of famous for never using sharpshooter when he played. And then, of course, there is Scrub Central. Scrub Central was perhaps the most winningest, is that a word? Winningest teams on Frag Nation. They usually won the latter seasons, and they were a really good team. One thing I think that they were particularly strong in is their teamwork. It was really hard to go up against them, especially because they were really good at backing each other up. You know, even if you were able to get one, the next guy was right around the corner, and they were really good with reviving and picking people up. It was a pretty unstoppable force within this scene. They even went on to win the Pumpkin Cup, which was a tournament that was happening on both PS3 and PS4 for those respective player bases, and it was supported by the Reddit and this user Blue Pumpkin. And I competed in this tournament. It was a lot of fun, and I especially miss really active and competitive tournaments. And so what was interesting about all this, the competitive scene, the Reddit records, any of the community events, was that even when the game itself was maybe starting to dwindle in support from Naughty Dog, the community was standing in and coming up with ways to keep the game fresh. The competitive scene, of course, continued to keep it fresh by showing the most elite gameplay and having very interesting matches, and then other community events along the way just help the community build. Of course, there are other things that happen in the community, and I'll talk about some of those, but these were kind of the ones that were happening in the early days of the PS4. But then there's patch 1.06, which came out, and this did something interesting and new. One, this added new DLC executions. So now, rather than just paying for guns, customizational items, and perks, these new special executions were brought to the game, which could be paid for DLC. And these were actually really cool. It just gave you a little bit of a interesting new visual flair as you were performing your special execution. I really love the 9mm one. For some reason, you just kind of pump a bunch of bullets into the person. But this added a lot of new freshness to the game. A lot of people really like these, and I think especially because these were not really game changing. But so these didn't add any gameplay changes, so it was more customization, so it wasn't really considered pay to win. I actually think Factions 2 probably will add DLC special executions as a way to monetize without affecting gameplay. But this patch also added new DLC weapons and DLC perks. It added the very infamous tactical shotgun. It added the burst pistol. In the patch notes, it's called the short rifle, but it's really the frontier rifle, and the crossbow. And then for survival skills, it added Lone Wolf, Second Chance, Jack of all trades, lucky break, and lethal efficiency. And then of course there was also some new DLC headgear as well as gestures. Now, while people did love the new DLC additions, this was perhaps one of the most contentious patches, especially because of the addition of the tactical shotgun. People did not like the shotguns in this game. The purchasable shotgun was very much hated. The shorty was also not popular, especially shorty dancing. It was something that drove people insane, me too. The tactical shotgun was adding a shotgun when shotguns were already super unpopular. And you kind of understand why they did it. It's, you know, this game, Factions, has a pretty tough learning curve. And so I believe Naughty Dog was looking for ways to make it a little easier for newer players who were just getting into the game to get used to it and get into it. So they added the tactical shotgun, but the problem here was that it was something that experienced players were using to much effect as well. And a lot of people don't complain about the frontier rifle, but I actually think that's almost just as bad as the tactical shotgun. And I think one thing that these two weapons introduced or kind of changed in the factions meta was the game kind of at this point became a two-shot to down type game. Most weapons at this point, or a large amount of the weapons at this point, were now two shots to down. You had the hunting rifle, tactical shotgun, frontier rifle, the bow, as well as, crossbow, El Diablo, and the shorty. And I might be missing some, but a lot of them. Basically, the idea was a lot of these very often used guns were now two shots to down. And it kind of changed the meta in that way, in that it kind of allowed for camping to be a little bit more effective than I think it used to be. Because you could kind of camp, and then as long as you got the jump on someone and got them with that first bullet, they were already lower than half health. And your chances of kind of coming back from that and surviving are pretty minimal. And so players really had to try to do a lot of things to adapt to facing off against a larger amount of these two-shot weapons. This is kind of where I believe pop shooting became a little bit more of an effective thing and a lot more of something that players needed to do in order to survive. That's where you're kind of standing behind cover and just popping in and out and shooting while you're popping in and out. You can do this with the semi-auto rifle as well and the burst, but this just kind of made it hard for players, even with great reaction time, to win out in these two-shot scenarios. It's definitely something that I noticed, is definitely something that I think a lot of people noticed, and it definitely changed the game from what it kind of was before. Another thing that became pretty apparent after the release of this patch was players were not very happy. I remember there was a lot of complaints that now this game had become pay to win. And that argument had been made earlier because ever since the release of patch 1.07 on the PS3, Naughty Dog had released paid guns and perks. But at this point, especially with the tactical shotgun, I think people were starting to get really pissed off. And also this was the PS4, and by this point there had been enough backlash for things that were considered pay to win, or even things that were altering the game. A lot of people who had played since the early PS3 days didn't have as big of an issue with these payable guns and perks, especially because a lot of people had known that the strongest guns and perks were all the free ones that were available with the game. But this did offer enough player variety that you could make arguments that especially things like the variable rifle and the tactical shotgun were pay to win in some respects. And so this ultimately gave a little bit of a negative strain towards this game. There were a lot of people that just had negative feelings about this game. This was also in addition to something that had been complained about during the PS3 days, and that is that the Platinum Multiplayer Trophy required a ton of playtime on factions. And it was good in a way that it introduced people to factions that probably never would have even considered it. And I think it did convert a lot of lifelong fans. But at the same time, having that serious of requirements was a little bit too much. And both of these things ended up being negative narratives that were associated with this game. But this patch also included a few balancing changes that are pretty important. For one, the silenced 9mm was now reduced to only one loadout point as a way to give the 9mm a little bit of an extra advantage. While I do think the 9mm is pretty viable, it wasn't, the strongest gun. The full auto rifle was then also given a silencer option. I totally forgot that it at some point didn't have a silencer. And then it also got its upgrade costs from 400 and 800 to 300 and 600 for each upgrade. The machete also was only 2 loadout points instead of 3, as well as getting an additional durability when it's modded. And then pretty important was some updates made to the spawning logic. And one thing that was for sure in the past was, especially on interrogation, was if you knew where players were spawning, you could spawn camp them pretty hard. It's still possible, but it's a little bit harder than it used to be. You used to know exactly where they were, and it was pretty egregious. There was this YouTuber, TLOU Extreme, who would often basically display how bad the spawning logic was, and he would play on interrogation and basically just sit in one spot where you could view people coming in, and as soon as they popped in, he would just destroy them. It was very unfair to players who really were just spawning in and already in complete danger, especially to well-coordinated teams that were abusing this. There also was some addition of new cover that was added to, I think, reduce a lot of the sightlines that maybe were perhaps a little bit too strong. University, for instance, there's this cover box added in one of the middle supply boxes in the classroom hallway that wasn't there before, and that was because there was a very popular spot you could get to where you could just snipe people's heads from the flower box. You could just snipe them immediately at that box, and you can still do that, but it's a little bit harder. These things were added to try to keep it a little more balanced and give players a little bit more of, especially newer players that wouldn't really know about these sniper spots, a little bit more of a chance. And now this patch actually came on December 9th of 2014, and pretty shortly thereafter there was already a live update making some fixes. There was a little bit of a slight nerf to the tactical shotgun and the frontier rifle already. This was on 12/24/2014, so a few weeks after this patch released, because what players were doing is they were firing and then quickly switching to another item and back to their weapon and then firing again. This was a way to kind of reduce the rate of fire. Usually there's a little bit of an animation that occurs in between shots that you could kind of get rid of when switching back and forth. Now, what's interesting here is that while Naughty Dog did nerf this for the tactical shotgun and frontier, they didn't completely remove this exploit. They left a little bit of a rate of fire increase that you could take advantage of by using this tactic, and that's because Naughty Dog did recognize that players can employ some of these tactics as a bit of a skill. So this is where things get a little bit of a gray area. Of course, something like wall shooting is not something that Naughty Dog would recommend, although they haven't patched it or really spoken on it, but I think it's a safe assumption they wouldn't want that to be something in the game. But this is something where it provides a little bit of a benefit, but not such a game-breaking one. And because it takes a little bit of a finessing with the controller, they wanted to leave a little bit of room for skilled players to take advantage of some of these things. I believe they referred back to games that had some popular little things that you could take advantage of that allowed for some small advantages. And I think that's important, honestly, that some of that remains, even with Factions 2, that there is a little bit of that. Of course, you have to judge it, by how game-breaking it might be, but certain little small advantages that kind of reward players that have developed a little bit of skill, I think should be allowed. Just not crazy things like wall shooting. Now, at this point, patches and updates were starting to kind of slow down, but there was still one that was fairly significant that occurred on 3/31 in 2015. And what this did was this gave a slight buff to the Frontier rifle by decreasing its upgrade costs from 400 and 800 to 300 and 600, as well as increasing their accuracy. Two things I don't think it was really needed, but I don't think enough people recognize how strong the Frontier rifle can be. Now, something that the community had been asking for forever finally happened, which was a nerf to the purchasable shotgun. So, players were really complaining for a long time, justifiably so. It is still, a very, even to this day, kind of an overpowered purchasable. And it's funny because people call it the 4-pointer, but it actually used to be 3 points. And so this changed the purchasable shotgun from 3 points to 4 points, as well as increasing the cost of ammo. The launcher was given a slight buff. It moved from 4 points to 3 points, as well as having its ammo cost decreased. And then some of the other guns, the military sniper, assault rifle, Specter, and flamethrower also had their ammo costs decreased. And something that I have been able to benefit from quite a bit is the survival skill Second Chance had its loadout point cost reduced from 2 and 3 points to 1 and 2 points. So now I'm able to put that 1 point Second Chance perk on most of my loadouts as I do today. And then another thing I want to mention that I wasn't able to really source exactly which patch this occurred in, but the bow was also given a slight nerf. It had this ability to corner shoot with it, where only your hand was exposed if you did this. And it allowed the bow a little bit of an advantage. One there where, of course, the bow is not one of the strongest guns in the game. It's quite a difficult gun to use, but Naughty Dog ultimately, I guess, decided that this was too strong of an advantage to have, and so made it so that your body did poke out now when you were corner shooting with the bow. And it's really funny to me because over the years with all of these patches and giving buffs to all these guns like the burst and the hunting rifle, frontier rifle, all these guns getting buffs. And then you have the bow here, which wasn't very strong. It was a very hard gun to use. Of course, there are people that do pretty well with it, but it was never super overpowered and definitely could have used a little bit of a buff. Now, I remember one of the excuses going around, I think this came from Naughty Dog, is that in the right hands, the bow could be super powerful. And while I definitely think that, yeah, there are some great bow players out there, I don't think that a buff to, say, the loadout point cost or the upgrade cost would have tipped the needle any further. And it certainly, I think, even in the right hands, doesn't make it stronger than someone that has a burst rifle and can one burst you. But this last patch that happened in March was perhaps one of the last significant patches that occurred. Something that Naughty Dog didn't actively tell us, but there weren't really any plans to do a whole lot of major updates from this point. And so we wouldn't really see them for a while. And so a lot of the responsibility for keeping this game afloat turned back to the community. And I mentioned earlier that there were community events that occurred, and at this point there was something called the clan battles. And this was, again, the Reddit community organized this, and this is where players with kind of like-minded either play styles or they came from kind of the same area joined together to create clans. And there were certain clans like the Purple Cobras and those Dirty Bastards and the Fireflies, San Frontieres, and there were others. But these clans kind of helped people build community and build a group with which they could play with. I don't think the battles really lasted too long, but it was something that helped keep this game afloat. It was almost like creating more factions within the factions community, but friendly competition. It was a little more friendly than FN, which was kind of more serious. Players took that really serious. And by the way, the FN community was still going very strong. This was actually around the time that I got my hands on the PlayStation 4. And I remember booting up the game and it was amazing. One thing that I did have issues with was I was getting a lot of input lag, which I didn't really understand at the time. You know, CRT TVs, which a lot of PlayStation 3s played off of, had a much smaller input lag. And so I felt like my character was doing exactly what I wanted him to. But with the PS4, I was playing on a TV that wasn't really tuned for gaming. And so I was just kind of frustrated. I felt much worse. But regardless, I still, became active in a lot of the competitive scene, especially because I had started on the PS3. So I joined Fragged Nation and it was very active. You could find a match in no time flat, and this was something that was pretty important for keeping the community alive, especially as Naughty Dog stopped really supporting. Another thing that kind of helped keep the player base alive was that a lot of PlayStations were being sold with The Last of Us Remastered bundled in. That's exactly how I got my copy of the Last of Us Remastered. It was a bundled deal, I believe, with a PS Plus as well. And so because of this, a ton of people ended up having the game and definitely helped keep the player base afloat, even without Naughty Dog actively providing additional support for it. Of course, though, without that active support and as the community kind of ebbed and flowed, players such as myself would kind of deviate off to other games. I remember I took a big time off playing Destiny. I was playing The Division, even Metal Gear Online. I was kind of hoping to find, honestly, a multiplayer that would kind of replace my love for factions. Nothing ever truly did, of course, but these were some nice little distractions that kept me away from factions long enough to pine for it again and come back. And as I said, Naughty Dog wasn't really actively supporting it. There was a few exploits. There was like this big coal mine exploit that was going around where players could get behind the rocks and they'd be able to see through the entire map. So there were some pretty bad exploits going on So Naughty Dog did patch this. What's interesting though is at this time, some of the more egregious exploits, they weren't really discovered yet. At least they weren't discovered in such a public way. It's hard to tell. I don't know if people knew about wall shooting and crab walking, and I'll get to those later, but these were seemingly exploits that could have been done from day one. I think it just took a while for people to discover that these were exploits. So Naughty Dog, of course, their multiplayer team was actually working on their next multiplayer. They were working on Uncharted 4 multiplayer, and there was a nice little beta that came out that again offered another nice distraction for us Factions players. And it was a lot of fun. And one thing that I noticed, and I think a lot of people noticed, was that it did try to incorporate certain things from Factions, things that the original Uncharted multiplayers didn't have, like the revive system and a pretty extensive kind of loadout system as well. And so eventually time came when Uncharted 4 came out. This was May 10th, 2016. And I think that this did end up serving a pretty substantial body blow to Factions. I think because of the similarities, because it was a Naughty Dog game, because some Factions players were Uncharted fans as well, I think a lot of people ended up jumping ship, at least for a while, from Factions. I know I did. I know that a lot of people that I was playing Factions with did. And I remember even the Uncharted multiplayer subreddit was populated with a lot of players that I knew from the Factions subreddit. So I think this really did, kind of give a big player base body blow to Factions. Of course, it's still trucked on, it's still carried on. And one thing I think that really, of course, for me, honestly, after my enjoyment of Uncharted multiplayer dissipated, I ended up taking a pretty big break from playing video games entirely. I would still log in every once in a while, play a Factions match or an Uncharted match, but I was kind of, on a bit of a break at the time. But one thing that certainly generated a lot of hype within the Factions community was in 2016, by the end of the year, when Naughty Dog announced The Last of Us Part 2 was coming. Because a lot of us Factions fans had assumed, of course, that meant Factions was going to get a sequel as well. And that ultimately did offer a lot of hope for us. We had loved our experience with Factions, and, it was a little bit sad seeing Naughty Dog not really actively supporting it, but knowing and understanding that, yes, they were going to be working on another multiplayer. We were going to be getting a proper sequel, something that, I think a lot of us, can imagine what was going to be providing a lot of the things that, we had hoped for. Things like an infected horde mode, things like a co-op, maybe a little bit more robust stats and private match options. All these things that we had always hoped for, but just never received with Factions, we believed we would get here. But of course, the wait for The Last of Us Part 2 was a pretty long wait. During this time, though, the Factions community still persisted. I know one thing that was pretty big in the community at the time was comebacks. Those videos were still doing very well on YouTube. I think a lot of people were really kind of getting into that for entertainment. This is also kind of the emergence of TLOU Strategist and Rage's Rager, both big Factions YouTube creators. One thing I know that TLOU Strategist did that I think was very helpful for keeping the community together was these monthly challenge videos. I think one was called Bow July or something like that. And, this was just something to kind of keep the game fresh, give players something to kind of challenge themselves with, for a month as they played. The competitive scene also kind of morphed at this time because Fragged Nation, the website, actually shut down. So a lot of the competitive scene, I believe, moved over to Esports Hub, ESHUB. And so the competitive scene still carried on. I should also mention that there were a couple small patches that did have some impact on Factions. There was the PS4 Pro came out, and so there were a little bit of enhancements that did apply to Factions for any PS4 Pro users. Basically, the main one that I saw was a toggle that allowed you to either prioritize and even super sample and kind of make your resolution a little bit more enhanced. And there was one that would target frame rates as well. So players did get that little additional option when playing. And then there was, I guess, an attempt to patch out this glitch that had been in the game pretty much since the beginning. It was called ground aim, and it was when you would aim your gun and it would actually pull your aim all the way down to the ground. It always happened in the worst scenario. And so one of the patches does claim to fix this, but it really didn't, because this still happens all the time. Perhaps the frequency of it was reduced with this patch though. And so this kind of takes us through 2017. The community is small, but of course, that hardcore base is still there, but things we're about to start taking some pretty bad turns in the wrong direction. Of course, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when this started. Of course, I mentioned the exploits earlier, but from what I could see, it seemed like 2017 was when the Crabwalking exploit began. And this is an exploit where you basically had unlimited sprinting and unlimited listen mode, and you could kind of traverse around the map really quickly. You looked obviously really weird, kind of like a crab doing it. That's why people called it the crab walk. It was, kind of a way to spawn camp people, and it was kind of one of those exploits that just gave people a little bit of advantage. Of course, this is one of the more controversial type exploits that are out there, because I think there are basically two camps. Some people really think that it's okay to use because it does take, some controller skill to pull it off, and it doesn't completely break the game. I mean, every time I've run into crab walkers, I've been able to kind of pick them off just as easily as anyone else. But you also have a group of people that are really against this as well, because, it is an exploit. And although Naughty Dog did kind of say that they are okay with certain types of exploits, I do think that this is probably one that goes above and beyond what they would consider acceptable. And so this exploit definitely has some people that are pretty passionate on either side. But of course, there's also the perhaps more infamous exploit that did pop its ugly head out around this time, around this period, and that is, of course, the wall shooting. And I don't know exactly when the earliest instance of the wall shooting began. I found a video from 2019 that kind of was showing it off, but of course, this was one of the worst things that could happen to this game, especially for a lot of us. We assumed Factions 2 was coming with The Last of Us Part 2, but Naughty Dog was pretty quiet about The Last of Us Part 2 for a long time, and so it was getting really hard to wait. And then you had this wall shooting happening, and Naughty Dog wasn't patching this game. They didn't really address these things. I don't even know if they probably didn't know about it for a while either, but it's just one of those things where, you had hope and then it started kind of waning. This also was the year 2019 when Naughty Dog decided to shut down the PS3 servers for Factions. They also shut down all the Uncharted multiplayer servers as well, but of course this was kind of a sad and scary day, I think, as it was just another marker that they're not interested in supporting these games anymore. I think it was definitely sadder for Uncharted fans than The Last of Us fans, because a lot of people by this point had their PS4s and were able to play Factions, but definitely was, kind of a doom and gloom time. And this happened in September of 2019. And then this is when things really got low. And that was on The Last of Us Day 2019, when we found out that The Last of Us Part 2 would not have Factions in it. And community was really pissed. The community was in an uproar. Twitter was exploding. People were really upset. I think Naughty Dog probably themselves were pretty surprised at how many people were affected by this. But it's always kind of a mistake to underestimate the multiplayer fans, because we have stuck around for years and the player base, while small, has been very passionate about this game. So this happened, but then Naughty Dog clarified that it doesn't mean that there won't be a sequel to Factions, but it may be in a different form. And this definitely helped, because it gave a lot of hope to the fans that at least they would be getting something someday. Although I don't think that many of us thought that we would still be here in 2023, still waiting. For me, at least, my interpretation of that message was that The Last of Us Part 2 would come out, and then the multiplayer would perhaps come out a few months to maybe 1 year later. But here we are, closing in on 3 years later. But of course, as we've gotten little small hints, we've come to realize that there has been a significant increase in the ambition of this project. And although it has been a tough wait, and to the point of me making this video, the most we've really gotten are 2 concept arts that you can kind of interpret some things off of. There's been some job postings where there's been some small details that maybe give us a glimpse. There's been some messages that you can kind of read into a little bit, but the details of this game are currently not there. And while we were promised more news this year in 2023, it's unclear if that's actually still going to happen, because there was an internal Bungie and Sony review that caused some internal delays. And in a lot of ways, this news has been heartbreaking. I think it's safe to say that as we arrive at the 10-year anniversary of this game, that we're kind of at a low point in the history of this beloved multiplayer. But I do still have hope, because the community is still here, and we're still playing, and there is still a lot to enjoy with this game. There even was a nice little bump or resurgence in the player pool when The Last of Us HBO show came out. A lot of people became reinterested in factions and playing and living in this world. And it's pretty encouraging to think that there are a good number of people perhaps waiting in the wings to jump back in with a faction sequel. And I have hope that we still will get to see the fruits of the labor that Naughty Dog's multiplayer team has been working on, and that we will get factions too one day. And my hope is that it will be something that gets supported for a much longer period of time and avoids a lot of the pitfalls that happened during the run of this amazing multiplayer. Just seems that we're likely going to have to wait longer than originally thought. When you think about the entire history of The Last of Us factions, the initial conception of what this game could have been, this sequel might be that full realization of it. And with that, I would like to thank you for taking this journey with me in the history of The Last of Us factions. Of course, this game continues to live on, and we are still here, and the servers are still up, and so the story continues. And so there may be a new interesting chapter in this game. The history of this game is not over just yet. And that's why, as we are here on the dawn of the 10th anniversary of this game, I wanted to celebrate it. So thank you for coming along for this ride, and if you missed any parts of the series, please check them out. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.